Hello everyone, welcome back to our managerial accounting class. Today is our second online session, and in this week we will focus on a new chapter, chapter 4, activity based costing. As we discussed earlier, costing is really important for a manufacturing company because their cost structure is really complicated. So each and every company, of course including the manufacturers, they always try to refine their cost. They always try to calculate the cost precisely and correctly. If you calculate your cost incorrectly, you will also be doing your pricing incorrectly, and that will negatively impact on your revenues as well as on your net income. So cost allocation system is really important, and for a manufacturing company they really need to know three types of costs, what we discussed in our first and second weeks. So these three types of costs are direct material cost, direct labor cost, and manufacturing overhead cost. Direct material and direct labor costs, these are actually traceable and you can really record it and calculate it precisely. But manufacturing overhead is the most complicated one. If you remember in chapter 3, we learned our job costing system where manufacturing companies actually use some predetermined manufacturing overhead rate to calculate their assigned manufacturing costs. And this is the formula that you learned in last week. So to calculate the predetermined overhead rate, you need to use their total estimated manufacturing overhead cost, and then you have to divide it by total estimated amount of the allocation base. Say for example, this is the example what we did in last class or last week. Their total estimated manufacturing overhead cost is 1 million and total amount of allocation base is 62,500 direct labor hour. So their predetermined overhead rate becomes $16 per direct labor hour. Remember, predetermined overhead rate is determined based on some allocation base. It could be their labor hour, it could be their machine hour, it could be their labor cost. Here in this equation, they are determining the overhead rate using one plant-wide or company-wide overhead rate. But if you produce different type of products, you will see that different type of products actually use different type of resources. And if you use one company-wide or plant-wide overhead rate, it may not give you very precise costing of that product. Say for example that exercise manufacturer, they actually prepare two type of exercise equipments, what we will discuss in this chapter, chapter 4. One is their elliptical and another is treadmill. So to produce one elliptical, they actually need 10 hours, and if we use the plant-wide overhead rate, which is $16 per direct labor hour, their allocated overhead cost will be $160. The company also produces treadmill, and when they produce treadmill they call it job 102, and to produce one treadmill they also need 10 direct labor hours. And if we use that common plant-wide overhead rate, then we will figure it out that their allocated manufacturing overhead cost to produce one treadmill is $160. That means we see for these two types of products, their allocated overhead costs are same when we are using the one plant-wide overhead rate. But now if we take a very deeper look, you will see that the company has two departments. One is their machining department and another is their assembly department. Although To produce 1 unit of both type of products, it requires 10 direct labor hours. But if you take a look into this diagram, you will see that for 1 ellipticals, they need to spend only 1 hour in the machining department, and they need to spend 9 hours in the assembly department. On the other hand, to produce 1 treadmill, they need to spend 4 hours in the machining department and 6 hours in the assembly department. So you see that to produce different products, they need to spend different hours in different departments. So if we could calculate our overhead rate based on these different departments, it will give us more precise overhead costings, because we see that different products or different jobs actually use different resources. So if we take this example, that for their 2 different departments, these are their departmental overhead costs. For machining department, the departmental overhead cost is 400,000. For the assembly department, the departmental overhead cost is 600,000. And as we know that all those costs should be driven by some cost driver or allocation base. It could be their labor hour, machine hour, or labor cost. So here in this example, for the both departments, their allocation bases are labor hours. And for the machining department, their total amount of allocation base is 12,500, and for the assembly department it is 50,000 direct labor hours. Now we can use the same formula to calculate our predetermined overhead rate, but we will be calculating 2 rates for these 2 different departments. So the idea is same. You have to take your total amount of estimated overhead cost, then you have to divide it by the total amount of allocation base. But here we are calculating 2 separate overhead rates for these 2 departments. And for the machining department, our estimated overhead rate is $32 per direct labor hour, and for the assembly department it is $12 per direct labor hour. Now if we use one example, for this example, the elliptical product, where the company uses 1 hour in the machining department and 9 hours in the assembly department to produce 1 ellipticals, and if we multiply our overhead rate for those specific departments with those corresponding hours that the company requires, we find that for the machining department, their overhead cost is $32 because the rate is $32 per labor hour, and the company spends 1 labor hour to produce 1 elliptical. And for the assembly department, the rate is $12 and it takes 9 hours, and the total overhead cost for the assembly department is $108. So if we add this, we will figure it out that the allocated overhead cost for 1 elliptical is $140. So you see, when we are using the department-wide rates, the overhead cost is actually different. But you know, here when we are using department-wide rates, these costs are more precise and more accurate. So we could do the same thing for the treadmill. So for the treadmill, it requires 4 hours in the machining department and 6 hours in the assembly department. And the rates are same what we already calculated. Now if we multiply the direct labor hour, all those predetermined rates for 1 direct labor hours by how many hours it takes in each department, you will figure out that to produce 1 treadmill, it costs $128 for the machining department, and the overhead cost to produce one treadmill in the assembly department is $72. So if we add these two together, we will figure it out that the total manufacturing overhead cost to produce one treadmill is $200. So now you see, when we are using more specific department-wide predetermined overhead rate, our overhead costs are different and we can compare it. So when we used our plant-wide one common overhead rate for both types of products, we found the same overhead costs. $160 for one elliptical, and it's the same for one treadmill, $160. But if you see when we are using our department-wide overhead rate, department-specific overhead rate, the costs are different. And these costs, when we are using department-specific rates, these costs are more precise and more accurate. So, if you use one common plant-wide rate for the elliptical, you are actually overcosting $20 because the more precise cost based on departmental rate is $140. On the other hand, for the treadmill, you are actually undercosting when you are using one common rate. But when you are using two specific rates for two different departments, you are getting here more accurate costs. So now we will check how we could do this costing more precisely. So instead of using one plant-wide rate or even department-specific rate, we can classify the production process into different activities. For example, this example here, you will see that to produce one product, they have different activities. They need to do machine setup, material handling, fabricating parts, supervising assembly, inspection, packaging. Now, we can classify the production line based on different activities, and we can calculate more specific overhead rate for each and every activity. And that is the main idea of activity-based costing. And activity-based costing is actually more accurate, more precise. So we can check what are the possible activities. So these are the common activities for the company. So they have machine setup, material handling, fabricating parts, supervising assembly, inspecting, and packaging. And for each type of activity, they have total amount of costs. Remember, everything here is predetermined. But instead of taking one plant-wide total amount of predetermined overhead or even department-specific overhead costs, we are actually now considering different activity-based overhead costs. Now, these costs will be again driven by some cost driver or allocation base. So now we will check what are the allocation base. So machine setup, the allocation base is number of setups. That means what will be your machine setup cost? That will be driven by how many setups you actually need. Another example, inspections. What will be the inspection cost? It will be driven by the number of inspections. Right, so you will see that for different activities, you have different allocation bases, and for different allocation bases, you also estimate your total amount of allocation bases. So for machine setup, the company requires 8,000 setups. For material handlings, the company requires 400,000 parts. So number of parts is the cost driver or allocation base. Fabricating parts. This type of activity and the cost related to this activity is driven by machine hours. And their total estimated machine hours is 12,500. So now here what we are doing, we are looking into each and every activity. We are checking what are those total estimated costs, and at the same time we are checking what are the total amount of allocation bases. Now we will apply our same concept. We will be calculating our predetermined estimated overhead rate for each and every activity, and we will be using different numbers and rates. So for every activity, these are their costs, and we know all those specific amount of allocation basis. So the idea is same. This is your total estimated overhead cost for machine setup, and this is the total amount of allocation base for machine setup. So if you divide this 80,000 by 8,000, you will get that for each machine setup it costs $10. So this is how we could figure out the predetermined overhead rate for every activity. So once we know the predetermined overhead rates for every activity, and then we can multiply our actual amount of allocation base with those predetermined overhead rates for one specific job. For example, to produce one elliptical, the company requires 2 setups, 20 parts, 1 machine hours, 9 direct labor hours, 3 inspections, and 52 cubic feet of packaging material. And we know for all those activities, we know all those predetermined rate. Now, if we take those specific activity-based predetermined rate and multiply by the actual amount of allocation base, we will figure out the overhead cost for those activities. So here we have machine setup, material handling, fabricating parts, supervising, assembly, inspecting and packaging. For every activities we figure out their specific overhead rates, and then we multiplied by those actual amount of allocation base, and this is how we figure out how much it costs for every activities to produce one elliptical. So to produce one elliptical for machine setup activity, it requires $20. For material handling activity, it costs $10. For inspection purposes, it costs $15. So now we know the cost for each and every activity to produce one elliptical. And if you add all those costs, you will find that the total allocated manufacturing overhead cost to produce one elliptical is $109. And this cost is completely different when you used the when you use the department based or plant wide overhead rate. We could do the same thing for the trade mill. So these are the predetermined overhead rates for every activity, which is common for all products. Now we're gonna multiply the actual amount of allocation base to produce one trade mill, and then you will find out the cost for all those specific activities to produce one trade mill. For example, to produce one trade mill, they need to do 4 machine setups, and you know that $10 is the machine setup cost, and if you multiply the total machine setup cost for producing one trade mill is $40. This is how you can check out the allocated overhead cost for every activity to produce one trade mill. And if you add the costs of all those activity based overheads, then you will figure out that the total amount of allocated overhead to produce one treadmill is $212. Now we're gonna compare those overhead costs, but we'll see that completely different pictures depending on what overhead rates we are using. For example, when we are using one common plant-wide overhead rate to produce one elliptical, the cost is $160. But when we are using department-specific overhead rates, the cost turns out $140. When we are calculating the same overhead based on different activities, it shows that the overhead cost for one elliptical is $109. So you see the costs are completely different depending on what type of overhead rates we are using. So of course, activity-based costings, here we are checking like more precise, more specific and more accurate costings. So activity-based costing will give you more accurate calculations. Now, these are the typical activities you will see here in this chapter, and for each and every activity you will have different cost driver. Now I will show you how you can solve the assignment problems, and we will be doing 2 assignment problems from chapter 4, and here we will calculate overhead rates for every activities, and at the same time we will calculate the total manufacturing overhead cost for each and every job. So please read these slides and do the 2 practice problems with me. Thank you very much.